Hi. There's an old saying, victors write the history books. After all, they're the ones who are alive, and they're the ones in positions of power. When they write the history books, they write them from their own perspective. They write them to, of course, make themselves look good. In some cases, to justify their positions of power that they hold. This is true in many, many cases. And it's true in Shakespeare's histories, sometimes called the Chronicles. Now, Shakespeare's plays stem largely from a very important time in English history called the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses lasted around 30 some odd years. What's important is that out of the War of the Roses, of course, came Henry VII, who started the Tudor dynasty of Queen Elizabeth, right? Henry VII was Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. Really, we go back pretty far in time. Way before the time of Elizabeth, way before the time of Henry VII to start. Interestingly, probably the most important person, at least in one sense, is King Edward III. Now, what's interesting is in our latest Norton Shakespeare, there is a play, Henry III. If you have the print edition, you have, by the way, no access to it. Sorry. As Dr. Howard says in her introduction, it is believed that Shakespeare contributed to Edward III. It's not entirely his. I think the online version of the book has the play. It's seldom performed. And honestly, I don't know very much about it. Plays, in terms of when Shakespeare wrote them, begin with Henry VI. And then that's in 3 parts, and then it kind of goes backwards in time. But eventually, excuse me, we get a sequence of about 10 plays, not counting Edward. It begins with Richard II. Now, I know I said in the comedy introduction, for instance, that when I heard I was going to teach English 240, that I knew I wanted to teach Midsummer Night's Dream right away. And As You Like It was a little bit longer in coming in terms of a choice of a second comedy, but I think was a good one. With the history plays, it's not quite so easy. I really thought about teaching Richard II. It is basically the start, not in terms of when Shakespeare wrote it, but in terms of the chronology of time. Richard II hangs very heavily over Henry IV, Part 1, and all the sequential plays afterwards, because it's about loss of power because of how shall we put it, an incompetent king. The history plays in general are very much concerned with this issue, or issues, if you will. What makes a good king? What are the qualities of a good king? And if you have a bad king, what happens? Right? Now, for sources, of course, it's been long noted that Holinshed's, what's it called? The Chronicle of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Holinshed's work, published in 1577, was a key source for Shakespeare, and that was based largely, in many cases, of course, for the earlier parts, on the history of the kings of Britain, written in 1137 AD in Latin. But of course, we all know that because we read that one in high school, right? By Geoffrey Monmouth. But the Chronicle by Holinshed is not the only source that could conceivably have influenced Shakespeare in writing his histories. There's also another book from slightly earlier called The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of York and Lancaster by a writer named Edward Hall. And some critics believe Hall is actually a more influential source because it does raise these thematic questions. The thematic question of the competence of kings. This is super important because, as I said, this is the whole point of the War of the Roses. Richard II, in history, okay, is deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. Right? I need to really emphasize this. If you believe that the king is God's representative on earth, and as the tradition has it, that the power goes to the eldest living son of the king, primogeniture, right? Concept of primogeniture. That creates, at the very least, a solid understanding of succession. No questions. The play and the history of Richard II posits the issue of, if you have a bad king, is it all right? Is it in fact necessary for maintaining the country, maintaining the social environment, to remove that king? That opens up a big can of worms, however. Because if you say, well, this king is incompetent, abusive of power, or neglectful, right, then that justifies, if you will, taking over the throne. But then you have competing claims to that throne. Who should take the throne? And then if they take the throne, what right do they have to pass their kingship on to their own line, right? Their own succession. This is where the the Chronicles, really rest. There's just a lot of issue with stability, with what is socially and politically desirable. An argument could be made, of course, that Shakespeare, writing during the time of Queen Elizabeth, that is a Tudor, has her claim to the throne questioned, by the way, right? Because she was obviously, first of all, not a man. Secondly, she was the product of Henry's second marriage, which was, well, it ended badly. Anne Boleyn, right? Very famously, of course, you may or may not know that Shakespeare's Theatre Company was hired to stage Richard II the night before a coup attempt. And in fact, there was a lot of suspicion at first around Shakespeare and his company of whether they knew that there was going to be a coup attempt. The coup attempt obviously failed. The point of having Richard II played was to bring out that theme that a bad king can and should, in fact, be replaced. Now, in history, right, this is what started the War of the Roses. Right? You had basically Henry Bolingbroke taking over the kingship, trying to, shall we say, pass that down to his son, Henry V, also known as Prince Hal in the plays, to represent the House of Lancaster. There is also competing claim, the House of York, right? Both houses, and this is important, both houses trace their genealogy to Edward III. Okay, they both can claim that they are the product of this legitimate king, Edward III, because after Edward III, that's when things go basically kind of sour. Edward III's immediate child, Edward the Black Prince, died before taking over the kingship, so it went down to the grandchildren. And as we all know, this is where things get ugly, right? As I said, Richard II, by many accounts, was not a good king. And that's the War of the Roses started. And then the War of the Roses goes on for, as I said, about 30 years, back and forth, between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. They call it the Roses because the Lancastrians were identified with the red rose. The family of York folks were assigned the white rose. I shouldn't say assigned, they just gone a white rose. And then you have the Henrys. Eventually, Richard III, we are reading Richard III this semester, has the claim. He is a Yorkist, right? He's from the House of York. And we'll talk about this more when we get to it, but he is basically seen as a pretty evil character. Right? He is one of Shakespeare's actual great villains. Richard III is defeated at Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor from the House of Lancaster. Right? My horse, my kingdom for a horse, right? As I said, we'll read that play too. This puts an end to the feuding between the dynasties, an end to the War of the Roses. Henry marries Elizabeth of York, unite physically the House of Lancaster and the House of York under what is now the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor dynasty, of course, goes from Henry VII to Henry VIII, to Edward, who's Henry's first male child that actually lived, but he actually doesn't live that long. Then you get Queen Mary, otherwise known as Bloody Mary. Yes, that's right. If you like to have Bloody Marys the morning after the night before, that's a tribute to Bloody Mary. Then Bloody Mary goes to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, being the Virgin Queen, has no heir directly, right? Which is a problem that we can talk about another time. It passes from her to a cousin named James Stuart, and that begins the Stuart dynasty. The point, though, of the histories, I think in many ways, is to justify Elizabeth's reign. Because with all the twists and turns that happen, the characters in the plays all eventually lead to the rightness of having a sound monarch, right? Of having a competent monarch. The corollary to having the competent monarch is that we owe that monarch our obedience, our loyalty, our allegiance. Shakespeare's England was in a, shall we call it, a boom time. Growing in power, stature, influence. Its competition with Spain was essentially won by England in a series of not only just simply military battles, naval battles, the Armada famously. So England is truly coming into its own. It's going to start developing colonies, as we all know, right, from our American history. This is an England on the rise. It's a very patriotic England. And Shakespeare, writing for the side of the victors, writes these 10 plays, maybe 10 and a half, that justify that. Keep in mind what's in the back of everybody's head, though. What happens when you get a bad king? We'll see.